Hello, incurable romantics. Prepare to travel back in time. The pearls felt like a hangman's noose. Each lustrous sphere, a perfect globe of milky white, lay cold against Evelyn Hayes's skin, a stark contrast to the feverish heat that coursed through her veins. They were a gift from Walter Sterling, the man who stood beside her, his hand a proprietary weight on the small of her back. To the glittering assembly of Chicago's elite, crammed into the Sterling family ballroom, they were a symbol of his devotion. To Evelyn, they were the final link in a chain binding her to a life she could not bear. The year was 1925, and the world was roaring. Jazz music, a wild and syncopated heartbeat, spilled from the orchestra on the dais, a vibrant cry for freedom that mocked the gilded cage of her existence. Women with bobbed hair and hemlines that dared to kiss the knee laughed with an abandon Evelyn could only dream of. Their laughter mixed with the clinking of crystal glasses filled with illicit champagne, a testament to the city's defiant spirit in the face of prohibition. Everyone was drunk on life, on progress, on the sheer dizzying speed of the new age. Everyone but her. "You are radiant tonight, my dear," Walter murmured, his voice as smooth and cold as the marble columns that lined the hall. He was a handsome man, sculpted by wealth and power, with eyes the color of a winter sky, and a smile that never quite reached them. The perfect jewel to adorn my arm. Evelyn forced a smile, a brittle thing she feared might crack her face. "You are too kind, Walter." He leaned closer, his breath smelling of expensive brandy and something possessive. "I am merely a man who appreciates beauty and value, and you, my dear Evelyn, are an acquisition of the highest order." An acquisition. The word echoed in the hollow space where her heart should have been. That was all she was. A solution to her late father's ruinous debts, a pretty treaty signed in silk and pearls. Her father, a good man with a disastrous affinity for bad investments, had left their family name teetering on the brink of disgrace. Walter Sterling, with his vast industrial empire and political connections, was their salvation, and she was the price. Her gaze swept the room, searching for an escape that wasn't there. She saw her mother, Beatrice, fluttering among the guests, her face alight with a desperate relief that was more painful to witness than any sorrow. She was safe now. Her future was secure. Evelyn was ensuring it. But as a flapper, in a shimmering beaded dress, was spun around the dance floor by her partner, a look of pure joy on her face, a fierce, primal scream built in Evelyn's throat. This was not living. This was a beautiful, slow death. She had to run. The idea, once a fleeting whisper, became a deafening roar. It was madness. She had nowhere to go, no money to her name save for the jewels that felt more like shackles. Walter's influence was a web that spanned the entire city. But the alternative, a lifetime of being Walter's perfect jewel, was a fate worse than any uncertainty that cold, dark streets could offer. An opportunity presented itself in the form of a clumsy waiter navigating the throng. With a subtle, almost imperceptible shift of her weight, Evelyn nudged a passing guest into the waiter's path. A cry of alarm, the crash of a tray, and a cascade of champagne and canapes created the perfect diversion. "Oh dear," she exclaimed, her voice laced with a convincing measure of distress. "Walter, Mrs. Vanderbilt is soaked through. You must see to her." Walter's attention snapped to the minor crisis, his face a mask of irritation at the disruption of his perfectly orchestrated evening. In that single moment of distraction, Evelyn slipped away. She moved with a grace born of desperation, melting into the crowd, her shimmering gown a pale ghost gliding towards the shadowed archway that led to the service corridors. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the distant pulse of the jazz band. Each step was a gamble, each second a stolen breath. The warmth and light of the ballroom fell away, replaced by the cool, stark reality of a stone hallway. The air here was different, smelling of floor polish and starched linen instead of perfume and cigar smoke. She tore the pearls from her neck, the clasp biting into her skin. They felt heavy, obscene, in her hand. For a moment she considered leaving them, but the practical side of her, the side that knew she would need to eat, to survive, won out. She shoved them deep into the tiny beaded purse that hung from her wrist. At the end of the corridor was a heavy oak door. It opened into a small, manicured garden, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. Beyond the wrought iron gates, the city beckoned, a sprawling beast of brick and steel, lit by the electric glow of 1,000 windows. Without a backward glance, Evelyn ran. Her delicate satin slippers, meant for dancing on polished floors, were no match for the unforgiving cobblestones. She kicked them off, the sharp cold of the stone, a welcome shock to her senses, grounding her in the terrifying reality of her choice. The hem of her expensive gown was soon stained with the grime of the city, a baptism into her new life. The roar of the city was different out here. It was not the curated sound of a party, but the raw, unvarnished noise of life. The clatter of an elevated train, the mournful wail of a tugboat horn from the lake, the distant, frantic energy of a Dixieland tune escaping the shuttered windows of a speakeasy. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and utterly, intoxicatingly free. She walked, for what felt like miles, drifting towards the industrial district where the shadows were deeper and the streets emptier. The wind whipped off Lake Michigan, cutting through her thin dress, and she wrapped her arms around herself, shivering not just from the cold, but from a profound and disorienting loneliness. She was a ship cut from its moorings, adrift on a dark and hostile sea. Walter would be looking for her. His fury would be cold and methodical. He would not stop. She needed to disappear. Ahead, a row of hulking warehouses loomed against the bruised purple sky. They were dark, silent sentinels from a bygone era. Most were boarded up, but one, at the very end of the street, had a small side door that hung slightly ajar, a dark sliver of invitation in the gloom. It looked abandoned, forgotten. It was perfect. With a final, furtive look over her shoulder, Evelyn slipped inside, pulling the heavy door closed behind her. The click of the latch was deafeningly loud in the cavernous silence. Absolute darkness enveloped her, thick and suffocating. The air was heavy with the smell of damp wood, motor oil, and something else, something sweet and sharp, whiskey. She stood frozen, letting her eyes adjust. Faint moonlight filtered through a grime-caked window high above, revealing the shapes of towering stacks of wooden crates. It was a tomb of forgotten cargo. She crept further in, her bare feet silent on the dusty concrete floor, and found a space to hide between two stacks of crates. Here she could wait until morning. Here she could think. She sank to the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline, and buried her face in her hands. A sudden harsh glare of light flooded the warehouse, blinding her. Evelyn's head snapped up. A single bare bulb hanging from a wire in the center of the vast space had been switched on, casting long, menacing shadows. Figures emerged from those shadows. 5 men, their faces hard and obscured by the brims of their fedoras. They moved with a quiet efficiency, not with the intention of loading machine parts, but with the practiced ease of men handling contraband. The sweet smell of whiskey was overpowering now. She had not found a forgotten sanctuary. She had stumbled into the heart of a bootlegging operation. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. She tried to shrink further into the shadows, to make herself invisible, but it was too late. One of the men, turning to grab a crate, saw her. His eyes widened, a flicker of white in his shadowed face. He let out a choked gasp. A bottle slipped from his grasp and shattered on the concrete, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the tense silence. Every head turned, every pair of eyes locked onto her. She was a butterfly pinned to a board, a splash of pale silk and terrified defiance in their world of grit and darkness. "Well, well, what have we here?" a gruff voice growled. Before she could scream, before she could even think to run, two of them were on her. Their hands were rough, their grip like iron on her bare arms. They hauled her to her feet, her desperate struggles useless against their brute strength. They dragged her across the floor, past the broken glass and the spreading pool of illegal liquor, towards a small, dimly lit office at the back of the warehouse. The door was kicked open, and she was shoved inside, stumbling to her knees on a threadbare rug. The room was Spartan: a filing cabinet, a coat rack, and a large, imposing oak desk. Behind the desk, shrouded in shadow and a curl of grey cigar smoke, sat a man. He didn't look up. He was studying a ledger, his focus absolute, as his men gave a hurried, low-voiced report. Double quotes ... found her hiding behind the Canadian shipment. Boss, dressed like a real Gold Coast doll. Says nothing. The man behind the desk finally closed the ledger with a soft thud. He lifted his head, and for the first time, Evelyn saw him clearly. He was younger than she expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with a face that looked as if it were carved from granite, all hard lines and sharp angles. His dark hair was slicked back from his forehead, and his eyes, when they finally settled on her, were the most arresting she had ever seen. They were a deep, stormy grey, intelligent, weary, and utterly unreadable. This was Artie Vance. She didn't know his name, but she knew with a primal certainty that he was the one in charge. He was the one who would decide her fate. He waved a hand, a silent dismissal. "Get back to work. I'll handle this." His men melted away, closing the door behind them and leaving Evelyn alone with the silent, watchful gangster. The air crackled with a tension so thick she could taste it. He expected her to cry, to plead, to offer him the pearls in her purse. He had seen it all before, but Evelyn Hayes had run out of tears. She had spent her entire life being polite, being proper, being pliable. No more. All that was left was a core of pure, unyielding defiance. She rose slowly to her feet, her chin held high, the grime on her dress and the dirt on her feet a testament to her flight. She met his gaze directly, her own eyes, blue like a summer sky, holding a storm of their own. Artie leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. He took a slow drag from his cigar, the ember glowing in the dim light. He had been expecting a frightened society girl. He was not expecting the raw, untamed courage that radiated from her. He saw the faint, purplish bruise forming on her delicate wrist, a ghost of a man's grip. "What's your name?" His voice was low, a gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in the small room. "Evelyn," she said, her own voice steady, though her insides were a knot of terror. He took another drag, his eyes never leaving hers. "And what?" he asked, the smoke curling from his lips like a ghostly serpent. "Is a girl like you running from Evelyn?" She thought of Walter's cold smile, of the stifling ballroom, of the life that had been laid out for her like a death shroud. Her answer was simple, honest, and stripped of all pretense. A cage. The word hung in the air between them. Arthur Vance, a man who built cages for others and lived in one of his own making, did not flinch, but something shifted in his gaze. It was not pity, it was not mercy, it was something far more dangerous. It was recognition. The gangster, who had seen and survived the worst the city had to offer, found himself utterly captivated by the runaway who had just stumbled into the heart of his darkness. The words settled in the smoky air, not as an answer, but as a confession. Arthur Vance looked at the young woman standing before him, her gown a ruined whisper of opulence, her eyes two defiant flames in a face smudged with city grime, and he saw the ghost of himself. He, too, lived in a cage. His was built of power, fear, and blood-soaked money, adorned with the finest things a man could buy, but its bars were no less real. He was a king in a prison of his own design. For the first time in a very long time, he felt a sting of something other than calculated interest or cold command. It was a dissonant chord of kinship. He extinguished his cigar in a heavy crystal ashtray, the gesture deliberate and final. "Most of the girls who find their way into my business are running to something," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Usually money, or away from a husband with a heavy hand and a light wallet. A society cage. That's a new one." He leaned back, his chair groaning in protest. His stormy grey eyes scanned her, a quick, appraising inventory. "Who put you in it?" Evelyn's chin remained high. To give him Walter's name would be to hand him a weapon, but to lie would be suicidal. This man, she sensed, had an almost animal instinct for deceit. "A man I was meant to marry," she said, choosing her words with care. "A man who believes a wife is something to be owned, and he's a man with influence, I take it." It wasn't a question. Someone who won't take kindly to having his property go missing. She didn't answer. The truth was etched all over her. The expensive, ruined dress, the ghost of pearls around her neck, the particular brand of desperate courage that only came from having everything, and therefore everything to lose. Artie stood up, his height and breadth more imposing now that he was no longer behind the desk. He moved with a surprising fluid grace, like a panther, all contained power. He walked around the desk until he was standing a few feet from her. The air between them was electric. He could smell the faint, lingering scent of her expensive perfume, now mingled with the dust of his warehouse and the raw scent of fear. "Here's your situation, Evelyn," he said, his tones shifting from contemplative to brutally practical. "You've seen my place of business. You've seen my men. In my world, loose ends get tied off permanently." The threat was veiled, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. A shiver traced its way down her spine, but she held his gaze. "However," he continued, a slight, almost imperceptible softening in his expression, "I find myself in a generous mood, and I don't like men who treat women like property. It's ... poor form." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "So I'm going to make you an offer. A trade, she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Your silence for my protection. The man you're running from, he'll turn this city upside down looking for you. He'll have every cop on his payroll sniffing down every alley. You won't last a day on your own, but he won't look for you with me, 'cause no one would be that stupid." He held her gaze, his own unwavering. "I'll keep you safe. I'll give you a place to stay where he will never find you. In return, you will see nothing, say nothing, and you will ... stay. You'll be my guest." The word guest sounded both like a promise and a threat. She was trading one cage for another. One was familiar, its gilded bars cold and predictable. This one was unknown, forged in shadows, and smelling of whiskey and danger. But she looked into Arthur Vance's eyes, and saw not the cold possessiveness of Walter Sterling, but a profound, weary solitude. He was a monster, yes. The city whispered his name in fear. But perhaps, she thought, with a surge of reckless hope, he was a monster with a code. "And if I refuse?" she asked, testing the limits of her new reality. A flicker of something disappointment, amusement, crossed his face. "Then my men will give you a few dollars for a bus ticket and drop you off at the city limits, and I will wish you the best of luck. You'll need it." He was giving her a choice, a real choice. Walter never had. That alone was enough. She took a slow, deep breath, the decision settling in her soul. "I accept your offer, Mr. Vance." He nodded once, as if he had expected nothing less. "Artie," he corrected her. "My friends call me Artie." He turned to the door and opened it. "Clarence," he called out, "bring the packard around, and get a blanket." The journey from the warehouse district to the penthouse was a surreal dream. Wrapped in a coarse wool blanket in the back of a gleaming Packard sedan that purred through the sleeping city streets, Evelyn watched the world transform. The gritty, industrial landscape gave way to the grand boulevards of the Gold Coast, then to the soaring, electric canyons of downtown. The car moved with an insulated silence, a bubble of power gliding through the night. Artie sat beside her, not speaking, his profile occasionally illuminated by the passing streetlights. He seemed lost in thought, a man carrying the weight of an empire on his shoulders. The Packard slipped into a private, underground garage of a building that pierced the night sky, a modern marvel of steel and stone. A private elevator, all polished brass and dark mahogany, carried them upwards in a smooth, silent ascent. When the doors opened, they did not open into a hallway, but directly into the penthouse itself. Evelyn stepped out, and her breath caught in her throat. If Walter's ballroom had been a cage of oppressive tradition, this was a cage of breathtaking modernity. The space was enormous, a vast expanse of polished hardwood floors and Art Deco furnishings. One entire wall was made of glass, a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a staggering, godlike view of Chicago. The city lights glittered below like a carpet of fallen stars, the distant rumble of its life muted to a gentle hum. It was beautiful and terrifying, a fortress suspended between heaven and earth. The room was a reflection of the man himself, a study in contrasts. A grand piano, its black lacquer gleaming, stood in one corner. The walls were adorned not with gaudy portraits, but with striking, modern art-bold colors and abstract shapes that spoke of a world breaking free from the old ways. A telescope was angled towards the window, pointed at the celestial bodies rather than the city below. And books. Books were everywhere. They filled towering shelves, were stacked on tables, their leather-bound spines whispering tales of history, philosophy, and poetry. "This is ... double quotes," she began, unable to find the words. "Safe," Artie finished for her. He walked over to a bar carved from dark wood and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy crystal glass. He didn't offer her any. "There are rules," he said, turning to face her, the glass in his hand. "You don't leave without my permission. You don't speak to anyone without my being present. My housekeeper, Mildred, will come in the mornings. She's deaf as a post and loyal as a dog. She'll get you anything you need. Clothes, toiletries, whatever you ask for." He gestured to a hallway. "The guest room is down there. It has its own bathroom. You'll find it ... adequate." Evelyn walked slowly towards the window, drawn by the mesmerizing view. She felt like an actress who had wandered onto the wrong stage. Just hours ago, she was the fiancée of an industrialist. Now, she was the guest of a gangster, a secret tucked away in a sky-high palace. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet, her reflection a pale shimmer against the backdrop of the glittering city. "Why are you doing this?" Artie swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching the way the light refracted through it. "Let's just say, I have a vested interest in keeping Walter Sterling unhappy," he said, his voice non-committal. "And I know what it's like to want to run." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. In that moment, Evelyn began to see the man behind a fearsome reputation. The man who read poetry and looked at the stars. The man who, like her, was a prisoner of his own life. The first few days were a blur of quiet observation. Mildred, a stern-faced woman with kind eyes, appeared each morning with soft, elegant clothes, simple silk chemises, wool skirts, and cashmere sweaters that were a world away from the restrictive fashions Evelyn had left behind. She ate her meals on a small table by the window, the food exquisite, the silence deafening. Artie was a creature of the night. He would be gone when she awoke, and would often return late, the scent of the cold night air and cigar smoke clinging to his coat. But sometimes she would find him in the main room in the late afternoon, sitting in a leather armchair, reading. He never seemed to startle when she entered the room, as if he was always aware of her presence. They rarely spoke, but a strange, unspoken language developed between them. She would watch him, trying to piece together the puzzle of his existence. He was ruthless. She heard it in the clipped, cold commands he gave over the telephone. He was cultured. She saw it in the way he would trace the spine of a book or stand for long moments before a painting. And he was profoundly lonely. She saw it most clearly when he stood at the great window, looking down at the city he ruled, his posture betraying a solitude so deep it seemed to absorb the light around him. One evening, drawn by an irresistible impulse, she sat down at the grand piano. Her fingers, stiff at first, found the keys. She began to play, a soft, melancholic piece by Debussy Clair de Lune. The notes filled the silence of the penthouse, a liquid stream of sound that spoke of moonlight, longing, and regret. She closed her eyes, losing herself in the music, pouring all her fear, her confusion, and her sliver of hope into the melody. When she finished, the final note hanging in the air like a sigh, she opened her eyes to find Artie standing in the archway of the hall, his coat still on. He hadn't made a sound. He was just watching her, his face unreadable in the dim light, but his eyes held an expression of raw, unguarded vulnerability that stole her breath. He didn't speak. He simply gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and walked towards his office. But the moment lingered. He hadn't just heard the music, he had heard what was behind it. He had heard her. That night, Evelyn stood at her own bedroom window, looking out at the same sea of lights. She had fled a gilded cage, only to find herself in another, far higher and more luxurious. But as she thought of the man in the other room, a man who understood the language of a sad sonata, she felt a terrifying and undeniable truth dawn on her. The bars of this new cage were beginning to feel less like a prison and more like a strange, dangerous, and utterly captivating embrace. The fragile peace of the penthouse held for 2 weeks. It was a strange, suspended existence for Evelyn, a life lived in the quiet spaces between the ticking of a grandfather clock and the distant wail of a city siren. She read Artie's books, discovering a shared love for the romantic poets Keats, Shelley, Byron, their verses a stark contrast to the brutal pragmatism of her host's life. She filled the vast apartment with the sound of his piano, playing Chopin and Liszt, her melodies weaving a delicate tapestry of emotion through the silent, masculine space. Artie remained an enigma, a man of carefully constructed walls, yet cracks were beginning to show. He started returning earlier, sometimes in time for the late afternoon sun to slant through the great window. He would sit in his leather chair, a glass of whiskey untouched on the table beside him, and simply listen as she played. He never commented on the music, but his presence was a form of communication, an admission of a shared need for something beautiful in a world that was anything but. The outside world, however, could not be kept at bay forever. It began to intrude in whispers and headlines. Mildred would bring the morning papers with the breakfast tray, and Evelyn would see her own face staring back at her from the society pages. Hayes' heiress still missing, one headline declared. Industrialist Walter Sterling offers substantial reward for information. Walter's face was there, too, a portrait of calculated grief and concern. He looked like the wronged lover, the powerful man desperate to find his lost bride. Evelyn knew better. He was the hunter, and the reward was not for her safe return, but for the retrieval of his stolen property. The pressure was mounting on Artie too. She could see it in the tense set of his jaw when he came home, in the way he paced before the window like a caged predator. The police, undoubtedly spurred on by Walter's influence, were becoming a nuisance. "Another raid tonight," he said one evening, his voice tight with frustration. He was shrugging off his overcoat, and she could smell the faint, acrid scent of smoke clinging to the wool. The precinct captain in the South Loop is getting greedy. Sterling must be lining his pockets well. Because of me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The book of poetry lay forgotten in her lap. Artie turned from the coat rack, his grey eyes meeting hers. He didn't deny it. Sterling is a blunt instrument. He can't find you, so he's decided to smash everything around me, hoping you'll fall out of the wreckage. He walked to the bar and poured a drink, his movements sharp and angry. He's not the only one. My rivals are getting nervous. They think a woman makes a man soft, vulnerable. He tossed back the whiskey in one gulp. They see you as a weakness, a target. The word hung between them, cold and sharp as a shard of glass. A target. Her presence in this sanctuary was not only a danger to herself, but to him and his entire operation. The thought was a lead weight in her stomach. She was the flaw in his armor, the crack in his fortress wall. The illusion of safety shattered completely on a Tuesday night. A storm was rolling in off the lake, the sky a bruised and turbulent purple. Evelyn was watching the lightning fork over the dark water, the city lights seeming to tremble with each distant rumble of thunder. Artie was late, later than usual, and a thread of anxiety she refused to name was pulling tight in her chest. Just after midnight, she heard it. It wasn't the smooth, familiar hum of the Packard arriving in the garage below. It was a cacophony of violence that seemed to travel up through the very bones of the building, the squeal of tires, a muffled shout, and then a sound that was unmistakable, a sound that ripped through the night with brutal finality. A gunshot, followed by another. Evelyn froze, her blood turning to ice. Her mind screamed at her to hide, to lock herself in her room, but her feet, acting of their own accord, carried her towards the private elevator. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She pressed the button, her hand trembling, and the brass doors slid open. She stepped inside, her finger hovering over the button for the garage level. It was madness. She should be running away from the danger, not towards it. But the image of Artie's face, a flitting moment of vulnerability as he listened to her play the piano, flashed in her mind. The elevator began its descent, the smooth, swift movement a horrifying contrast to the chaos she might find below. When the doors opened, the scene was one of controlled pandemonium. The big Packard was slewed at an angle, its front fender crumpled against a concrete pillar. Another car, a dark Ford sedan, was half in shadow. Its passenger door swung open like a broken wing. Clarence, Artie's hulking driver, was there, a pistol still clutched in his big hand, his face a grim mask. And then she saw Artie. He was leaning against the side of the Packard, his left arm pressed tightly to his side. His face was pale, his jaw set in a line of pure agony. A dark, wet stain was spreading rapidly across the pristine white silk of his shirt, just below his shoulder. Artie! The name was torn from her throat, a choked cry. He looked up, his eyes widening in shock and fury when he saw her. "Evelyn, get back in the elevator, now," he snarled, his voice a ragged command. But she was already moving, rushing to his side, her earlier fear replaced by a wave of adrenaline-fueled purpose. "You're hurt," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "It's a scratch," he bit out, wincing as he tried to straighten up. "Don't lie to me." Her gaze was unflinching. Clarence holstered his weapon. "It was O'Banion's crew, boss. They were waiting for us. We got one of them, but the other two got away." He looked at Evelyn, his expression a mixture of apology and concern. "We need to get him upstairs." Between them, they managed to get Artie into the elevator and back up to the penthouse. The luxurious apartment, once a symbol of untouchable power, now felt violated, the specter of violence having followed them home. Evelyn's mind raced, Her mother had insisted she learn basic first aid, a skill for a society wife to manage household accidents. She'd never imagined using it to tend to a gangster's gunshot wound. Boiling water, clean cloths, and the whiskey from the bar, she ordered Clarence. Her voice taking on an authority that surprised them both. She helped Artie out of his blood-soaked suit jacket and shirt, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. He hissed in pain as the fabric pulled at the wound. It was not a scratch. The bullet had torn a ragged path through the fleshy part of his shoulder, exiting cleanly but leaving a bleeding, angry mess. For a man who exuded such absolute control, his sudden vulnerability was a profound shock. She saw the sheen of sweat on his brow, the faint tremor in his hand. She worked with a focused intensity, cleaning the wound with whiskey. He didn't even flinch, though a muscle in his jaw jumped, and then packing it tightly with strips of clean linen from a freshly laundered shirt. Her movements were gentle, efficient. He sat silently in the leather armchair, watching her, his expression unreadable. The storm broke outside, rain lashing against the great window, a percussive accompaniment to the tense silence in the room. Once she had bandaged him as best she could, she finally sat back on her heels, the adrenaline leaving her weak and trembling. The reality of what had happened, what could have happened, washed over her. He could have been killed because of her. "They will come back," she whispered, staring at the white bandage stark against his tanned skin. "I'll be ready for them," he said, his voice low and rough. "This is my fault. They see me as your weakness. They were right." He reached out with his good hand, his fingers brushing her jaw, a touch so unexpectedly gentle it made her gasp. He tilted her face up so she was forced to look at him. His eyes were dark with an emotion she had never seen before, not anger, not command, but a deep, haunting sorrow. "This is not your fault," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "This world, it was mine long before you fell into it." He let his hand drop, his gaze drifting to the rain-streaked window. "This isn't the first time. I once knew someone who had no place in this life. She was like you. She saw beauty in things. She thought there was good in me." Evelyn listened, holding her breath, knowing she was about to be allowed a glimpse behind his carefully constructed walls. "Her name was Lillian," Artie continued, his voice hollow with memory. "It was years ago. I was younger, more reckless. I thought I could have both. I thought I could keep her safe in one world while I burned down the other." He closed his eyes for a moment. "A rival crew wanted to send a message. They didn't come for me. They waited for her outside the library." The silence that followed was heavier than any words. Evelyn could picture it perfectly. An innocent girl, a love of books, caught in the brutal crossfire of a world she never made. "I built this place after that," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "This fortress in the sky. I've filled it with things she would have liked." He looked at the piano, at the bookshelves, at the telescope. "I swore I would never let anyone get close again, that I would never again let my world poison someone else's." He finally looked back at Evelyn, and the pain in his eyes was a raw, open wound. "And then you stumbled into my warehouse, running from your own cage, and I broke my own damn rule." In that moment, everything shifted. He was no longer Arthur Vance, the feared gangster, her captor. He was just a man, haunted by ghosts, desperately trying to prevent history from repeating itself. His coldness, his distance, it hadn't been about controlling her. It had been about protecting her. The gilded cage wasn't for his possession. It was for her preservation. Fear, which had been her constant companion, slowly gave way to a wave of overwhelming, heartbreaking compassion. She looked at this powerful, wounded man, and for the first time, she wasn't thinking about how to escape. The confession, raw and steeped in old grief, hung in the air between them long after the storm had passed. Lillian. The name was a ghost that now haunted the elegant corners of the penthouse, explaining the sad sonatas, the poetry of loss, the fortress built around a man's heart. For Evelyn, the revelation changed everything. Artie's distance was not rejection, but a shield. The gilded cage was not a prison, but a desperate, flawed attempt at a sanctuary. A dangerous and profound tenderness began to take root in her heart, a flower growing in the cracks of a concrete wall. But Artie, having exposed a chink in his armor, immediately began to seal it shut. In the days that followed the attack, he became more remote than ever. The vulnerability she had witnessed vanished, replaced by a cold, efficient steel. He healed quickly, his physical strength a testament to his resilience. But a new, impenetrable wall of ice was forming around him. He began to treat her, not with the quiet, observant respect of before, but with a curt, detached courtesy that was somehow crueler than any overt anger. He was trying to push her away, for her own good. She understood it on an intellectual level, but her heart, foolish and defiant, refused to accept it. The pressure from Walter Sterling was escalating from a nuisance to a slow strangulation. More raids. Key shipments of Canadian whiskey were seized at the border. One of Artie's most profitable speakeasies was shut down by federal agents in a blaze of publicity. Walter was not just trying to flush Evelyn out, he was systematically dismantling Artie's empire, piece by piece. The financial bleeding was severe, and the whispers of discontent from Artie's own men grew louder. Their king, it seemed, had been compromised, and Evelyn was the cause. She felt like a pariah, a walking curse. The quiet luxury of the penthouse now felt suffocating, the beautiful view of the city mocking her confinement. She watched Artie come and go, his face a mask of grim determination, the easy, fluid grace in his movements replaced by a rigid tension, as if he were carrying the weight of the world. He stopped listening to her play the piano. He no longer sat with his books in the afternoon. The small, unspoken rituals that had formed a fragile bridge between their two worlds were gone, leaving only a cold, echoing silence. One evening, she couldn't bear it any longer. He was standing at the great window, a dark silhouette against the twilight sky, a telephone receiver pressed to his ear. His conversation was clipped, brutal. ... I don't care what it costs, you pay him off. If he won't be bought, you lean on him. Find his family. Everyone has a price, or a breaking point. Handle it. He slammed the receiver down, the crack of it echoing in the still room. He stood there for a long moment, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed bone deep. "Artie," she said, her voice soft. He stiffened, but didn't turn around. "What is it, Evelyn?" His tone was flat, devoid of emotion. "Talk to me," she pleaded, walking towards him. "Don't shut me out. I want to help." He finally turned, and the look on his face was glacial. "Help? How, exactly, do you plan to help? By playing another sad song on the piano? By reading me a poem? This is my world, Evelyn. You have no place in it." The words were like a physical slap. "That's not fair." She shot back, stung. "You let me into it. You brought me here." "I brought you here to keep you safe," he retorted, his voice rising, a dangerous fire kindling in his gray eyes. "Not to make you a part of my life. That was the mistake I made. A mistake I am now paying for, every single day." "A mistake?" she echoed, her own anger flaring to meet his. "Is that what I am to you? A piece on your chessboard that you moved incorrectly? A liability you have to manage?" "Yes," he exploded, taking a step towards her. "That's exactly what you are. You are Walter Sterling's obsession, and now you are my vulnerability. My men are questioning my judgment. My enemies are circling like sharks that smell blood in the water. Everything I have built is at risk because I was foolish enough to bring a goddamn society girl into my home." Each word was a dagger, and they found their mark. All her compassion, all her budding affection, curdled into a hurt so profound it felt like a betrayal. She had seen the wounded man behind the monster, and now the monster was telling her she had imagined it all. "So I'm just a prize," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and sorrow. "Something Walter wanted, and you took. A pretty object to be kept in a cage, whether it's his or yours. You're no better than he is." The moment the words left her mouth, she knew she had gone too far. The fury in his face dissolved, replaced by something far worse, a look of deep, profound hurt. The accusation landed with the force of a final, fatal blow. He looked at her as if she had ripped open his old wound and poured salt in it. "Get out," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. He turned his back on her, staring back out at the city lights. "What?" "I said get out," he repeated, his voice shaking with a tightly controlled rage. "Go to your room. I don't want to look at you right now." Tears blurred her vision as she fled, his rejection a searing brand on her heart. She locked herself in her room, the sound of her own ragged sobs muffled by a silk pillow. He was right. She didn't belong here. Her presence was destroying him. She had run from one cage, only to become the bait in a much more dangerous trap, and the zookeeper was now being savaged because of her. Her decision was made in that maelstrom of grief and guilt. She had to leave, not to save herself this time, but to save him. As long as she was here, she was a weapon that could be used against him. Walter would never stop. His rivals would never stop. If she disappeared, truly disappeared, the target would be gone. Artie could go back to his life. He could rebuild. He could be safe. Her heart fractured at the thought. To leave him meant she would never see him again, never hear his low voice, never again feel that strange, magnetic pull. But to stay meant his certain ruin, or worse. The choice was no choice at all. Love, she was discovering, was sometimes an act of radical departure. She waited until the deepest part of the night, when the city's pulse had slowed to a crawl and the penthouse was shrouded in a profound silence. She had nothing to pack except the clothes Mildred had brought her. She chose a simple dark dress, practical shoes. Her beaded purse from the night of her escape was still in a drawer. Inside, the pearl necklace Walter had given her felt like a cold, dead weight, a bitter irony. The symbol of her first captivity would now fund her new freedom. She sat at the small desk in her room, a piece of hotel stationery and a fountain pen before her. What could she say? How could she explain an act that was tearing her own soul apart? "Artie," she wrote, her hands shaking. "You were right. I am your weakness. I cannot stand by and watch my presence destroy you. I am leaving, not because I am running from you, but because I am trying to save you from me. Please, do not look for me. Let Walter Sterling believe he has won. Let him believe I have simply vanished. In time, he will give up. Your world can go back to the way it was. You gave me a sanctuary when I had none. You showed me a kindness I never expected. For that, I will be forever grateful. Please be safe. Yours." She paused, her pen hovering over the paper. She couldn't write Evelyn. It felt too formal, too distant. With a trembling hand, she simply wrote the initial, E. She left the note on her pillow, a single folded white square in the moonlight. She crept out of her room, her heart pounding with every silent footstep. The main room was dark, save for the eternal glow of the city lights through the window. She could just make out his shape, still sitting in the leather armchair, a solitary figure lost in the shadows. She ached to go to him, to touch his face one last time, to tell him the truth she couldn't write in the note, that her heart was breaking, that in this strange, dangerous man, she had found something she had never known she was looking for. But she couldn't. She turned towards the elevator, the brass doors a gateway to an unknown, lonely future. With one last, tearful glance at the shadowed figure in the chair, Evelyn Hayes stepped inside and pressed the button. As the door slid silently shut, she vanished into the night, leaving the king alone in his castle in the sky. Do you believe that love can conquer time? Tell us in the comments. The The silence Arthur Vance had so desperately cultivated now became his tormentor. When Mildred found the note the next morning, she did not need to read it to understand. The perfectly made bed, the closet devoid of the simple silk dresses, the palpable emptiness of the guest suite, it all spoke a language of departure. She placed the single folded piece of stationery on the corner of his desk and left without a word. Artie stared at the note for a full hour before he could bring himself to touch it. His initials, A.V., were embossed in gold on the heavy cream paper. An absurd detail. He finally unfolded it, his hands steady, betraying none of the chaos that was storming within him. He read her words once, twice, a third time. "I am trying to save you from me." The phrase was a punch to the gut. She had misinterpreted his anger, his calculated coldness, as the absolute truth. He had wanted to push her away to keep her safe, and he had succeeded all too well. He had driven her out of his fortress and into the jaws of the wolves. A rage unlike any he had ever known seized him. It was not the cold, controlled anger he used as a weapon in his business dealings. This was a hot, terrifying fury, directed not at Walter Sterling, not at his rivals, but at himself. He swept his arm across his desk, sending ledgers, pens, and a half-empty glass of whiskey crashing to the floor. The sound of shattering crystal did nothing to quell the storm inside him. He had told her she was a liability, a mistake. He had taken her compassion and thrown it back in her face, and he had let his fear, his ghost of Lillian, turn him into the very thing he despised, a man who wounded the one person he was trying to protect. "You're no better than he is." Her words echoed in the ruins of his office. "Clarence," he roared, his voice a raw thunder that shook the penthouse. The big man appeared in the doorway in seconds, his face impassive, but his eyes wide with alarm. He took in the scene, the shattered glass, his boss's white-knuckled fury. "Find her," Artie commanded, his voice lethally low. "Tear this city apart. Every flophouse, every train station, every boarding house for women. Use every man we have. I want every street corner watched. Find her, boss, if Sterling's men are out there. ... But Clarence began, his brow furrowed with concern. "I know," Artie snapped. "That's why we have to find her first." He grabbed his coat, his injured shoulders screaming in protest as he shoved his arm into the sleeve. "Get the car. I'm not waiting here." For Evelyn, freedom was a cold, anonymous hell. The sale of the pearl necklace at a pawn shop in a grimy, forgotten corner of the city yielded less than a quarter of its worth, but it was a small fortune to her, enough to disappear. She bought a cheap, drab coat, a boyish cap to hide her distinctive blonde hair, and a ticket for a train leaving for nowhere in particular. But she couldn't bring herself to board it. Leaving the city felt like a final act of surrender, a severing of the last, invisible thread that connected her to Artie. She found a room in a dreary boarding house for working women on the west side, a place of peeling linoleum and the pervasive smell of boiled cabbage. Here she was just another face, another woman with a past she didn't talk about. She spent her days trying to lose herself in the vast, teeming metropolis. She walked for miles, her head down, her cap pulled low, avoiding the grand boulevards and sticking to the crowded market streets and working class neighborhoods where no one would look twice at a woman alone. The city that had looked like a carpet of jewels from Artie's window was, up close, a place of grit, desperation, and surprising kindness. She saw the struggle and the resilience etched on the faces of the people she passed, and for the first time felt a sense of connection to the world beyond her gilded cages. But at night, in her small, cold room, the loneliness was a physical ache. She would lie awake and picture the penthouse, imagining Artie standing at the window, alone in the silence she had created. Had he been angry? Relieved? Had he even cared? The uncertainty was its own form of torture. She'd been gone for 3 days when her luck ran out. A persistent, miserable rain had been falling all afternoon, turning the city streets into slick, black mirrors that reflected the gloomy sky. Evelyn was huddled in the doorway of a closed butcher shop, waiting for the downpour to lessen, the damp chill seeping into her bones. She had been careless, so lost in her own melancholic thoughts that she hadn't been paying attention to her surroundings. A black Ford sedan, its engine a low growl, pulled up to the curb. It was just a car, but some primal instinct screamed at her. The same model as the one from the garage ambush. Her blood ran cold. 2 men in dark coats and fedoras got out. They didn't rush. They moved with a calm, predatory confidence that was far more terrifying than any overt aggression. She recognized one of them from Walter's engagement party, a brutish man who served as Walter's personal driver and bodyguard. There was nowhere to run. The street was empty, save for them. Evelyn backed away, flattening herself against the cold tile of the shop front. "Miss Hayes," the bodyguard said, his voice a gravelly monotone. "Mr. Sterling has been very worried about you. He's asked us to escort you home." "I'm not going back," she said, her own voice a pathetic tremor. The man smiled, a humorless slash in his broad face. That wasn't a request. He lunged for her. Evelyn reacted on pure instinct, ducking under his grasping arm and darting into the narrow, refuse-strewn alley beside the shop. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. The alley was a dead end, a high brick wall closing it off. She was cornered. The 2 men followed her in, blocking the exit, their large frames filling the narrow space. The rain intensified, plastering her hair to her face, the icy water running down her neck. The world narrowed to this dark, wet passage, the smell of garbage, and the menacing advance of the 2 figures. Her desperate flight was over. Walter had won. "Let's make this easy, miss," the bodyguard grunted, advancing slowly. Just as he reached for her, a sound cut through the drumming of the rain. It was the screech of tires, sharp and violent, from the street just beyond the alley's mouth. The 2 men paused, turning their heads. And then, like ghosts materializing from the downpour, figures appeared at the mouth of the alley. Artie's men. Clarence was in the lead, his face a mask of cold fury, a Thompson submachine gun held low at his side. But it was the man who stepped through them that made Evelyn's heart stop. Artie. He was soaked to the bone, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his fine wool coat dripping with rain. He had no weapon in his hands, but he was more dangerous than any of his men. The cold, controlled mask was gone. His face was a canvas of raw, untamed fury, and his stormy eyes, when they locked on her, were blazing with a terrifying, protective light. He took in the scene in an instant. Evel, pale and trembling, cornered by Walter's thugs. The cold facade he had so carefully constructed in front of her for weeks completely shattered. The sight of her, so small and terrified, and in the path of real danger, broke through every wall, every defense, every ghost of his past. The gangster, the strategist, the cold-hearted businessman disappeared. All that was left was the man. "Get your hands off her," Artie said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the rain with the chilling finality of a death sentence. Walter's men were momentarily stunned, caught between their prize and a force of nature they had not anticipated. The bodyguard, overconfident, sneered. "Vance, this ain't your business. This is a private matter for Mr. Sterling." "She is my business," Artie growled, taking a step forward. "Everything about her is my business." The bodyguard made his final mistake. He decided to call Artie's bluff, reaching again for Evelyn's arm. What happened next was a blur of brutal efficiency. Artie moved faster than she could have imagined, closing the distance in 2 long strides. There was the sickening crunch of bone as his fist connected with the bodyguard's jaw. The big man staggered back, surprise and pain warring in his eyes. The second man went for a gun inside his coat, but Clarence was faster. He didn't fire. He simply stepped forward and used the butt of his heavy gun as a club, a swift, decisive blow that sent the man crumpling to the wet ground. Artie was a whirlwind of controlled violence, his fists landing with a cold, punishing precision that was terrifying to behold. It was over in seconds. The two men were left groaning and broken on the grimy cobblestones. Artie stood over them, his chest heaving, the rain mingling with the sweat on his brow. Then he turned to her. He walked the final few feet that separated them, his burning gaze never leaving her face. She was trembling, from cold, from fear, from the violent aftermath. He reached her and stopped, his hands clenched at his sides, as if fighting the urge to either shake her or crush her in an embrace. All the fury, all the violence, drained away, replaced by an expression of such profound, desperate relief that it broke her heart. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. She could only nod, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. He finally let himself touch her, his hand coming up to cup her cheek, his thumb gently brushing away a drop of rain. His touch was not possessive, not angry. It was the touch of a man who had found something precious he thought he had lost forever. The cold gangster was gone. The king of the underworld was gone. In the dark, rain-slicked alley, there was only Artie, looking at her as if she were the only thing holding his world together. The ride back to the penthouse was a study in taut silence. Evelyn sat beside Artie, in the back of the Packard, wrapped in his still warm overcoat, the scent of rain, wool, and him enveloping her. Neither of them spoke. The violent ballet of the alley had stripped away all pretense, leaving them raw and exposed. Words felt inadequate, fragile things in the face of the tempest of emotion that crackled in the confined space of the car. She could feel him watching her, his gaze intense, a silent conversation passing between them that was more potent than any spoken one. When the private elevator doors opened into the familiar, quiet luxury of the apartment, the tension that had been held in check during the journey finally snapped. Artie walked straight to the bar, his movements stiff. He poured 2 glasses of brandy, his hand shaking almost imperceptibly. He walked back to where she stood, dripping onto the polished floor, and pressed one of the heavy Cristo glasses into her cold hands. "Drink it," he commanded, his voice hoarse. She took a sip, the fiery liquid, a welcome shock that spread warmth through her chest, chasing away some of the bone-deep chill. He drained his own glass in a single, desperate swallow and set it down with a sharp click. He began to pace before the great window, a caged tiger unable to contain the ferocious energy coiling within him. "What in God's name were you thinking?" he finally burst out, whirling to face her. The fury was back, but it was different now. It was laced with fear. Did you have any idea what they would have done to you? What he would have done? To walk out of here alone, with nothing but a handful of cash from a pawned necklace. It was suicide, Evelyn. "I did it to protect you," she cried, her own voice finding its strength. She set her glass down, her hands clenched into fists at her side. "You said it yourself. I was your weakness, a liability. Walter was tearing your world apart. Your men were turning on you. Your rivals tried to kill you, all because of me. I couldn't stay and watch you be destroyed for my sake. Protect me?" He let out a harsh, incredulous laugh that held no humor. "Do you think my world falling apart is what I'm afraid of? Buildings, businesses, that's just brick and money. It can all be rebuilt. It can all be bought back." He strode towards her until he was standing directly in front of her, his stormy eyes boring into hers. "You want to know what I'm afraid of? I'm afraid of finding you in a dark alley, cornered and terrified. I'm afraid of the silence in this apartment when you're not here. I'm afraid of a world that doesn't have you in it. That's what I'm afraid of, Evelyn." His confession, torn from the deepest part of him, silenced her. The air vibrated with the truth of his words. For 3 days, he continued, his voice dropping to a raw, ragged whisper, I have lived in a hell of my own making. Every time the phone rang, I expected it to be the police, with news of a girl's body pulled from the river. Every time a car backfired, I thought it was a gunshot with your name on it. The silence. God, the silence in this place, without your music, without the sound of you just being in the next room. ... It was deafening. He reached out his hands, framing her face, his touch both desperate and exquisitely gentle. Lillian ... What happened to her taught me to build walls, to never let anyone in. I thought those walls kept me safe. But they didn't. They just kept me alone. And then you came. You didn't just stumble into my warehouse, Evelyn. You stumbled into my life and showed me what a desolate prison I'd been living in. Tears streamed freely down her face. Tears not of fear, but of a profound, overwhelming sense of homecoming. When I said you were my weakness, he murmured, his thumbs stroking her tear-stained cheeks, I was a fool. I was wrong. You are not my weakness, Evelyn. You are the only thing that has made me feel strong in years. You are my reason, my ... clarity. The last word was spoken with a sense of awe, as if he had just discovered it himself. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, and she could feel the faint tremor that ran through his powerful frame. He was laying his soul bare for her, offering her the broken, beautiful pieces of his heart. I can't offer you a normal life, he whispered, his breath warm against her lips. I can't promise you safety in the way the world understands it. My world will always have shadows. There will always be danger. I will spend the rest of my days looking over my shoulder. But I can promise you this. I will stand between you and every single threat. I will burn the world to the ground to keep you safe in it. I am not asking you to be my prisoner in this penthouse. I am begging you to stay, to build a life with me, right here, to be my partner, my equal. He pulled back slightly, his gaze holding hers, intense, searching. He was giving her everything, laying his entire world at her feet. But I have to give you the choice I should have given you from the start, he said, his voice firm, resolute. The choice I was too selfish to offer before. I love you too much to keep you in a cage if you truly want to fly. He let go of her and walked over to the desk. He opened a drawer and took out a leather-bound bank book and a small velvet pouch. He placed them on the polished surface of the desk. This is your choice, Evelyn, and I will honor whatever you decide. Option 1. You stay here with me. We face Walter Sterling together. We face all of it together. I will never lie to you, and I will never shut you out again. He gestured to the items on the desk. Or, option 2, in that book is an account in a Boston bank. It has more than enough money for you to start a new life anywhere you want. In this pouch are papers. A new name, a new identity, flawless. Clarence can have you on a train tonight. I will create a story, a rumor that you are gone, that you fled the country. I will make Sterling believe it. He will eventually stop hunting you. You can be free, completely and truly free, safe and a world away from me and the violence that follows me. He looked at her, his heart in his eyes, the powerful gangster utterly stripped of his armor, vulnerable, waiting for her verdict. The choice is yours, he said, his voice thick with unshed emotion. Stay and share my world, or leave and find your own. But choose now, because I don't think I have the strength to let you go twice. Evelyn looked from the bank book, a symbol of a safe, easy, anonymous future to the man standing before her. A man who was offering her a dangerous, complicated, and shadow-filled life. A man who was also offering her a love so fierce and absolute it took her breath away. She thought of the cold safety of her former life with Walter, a life without love. She thought of the lonely freedom she had just experienced, a life without connection. She realized, in that moment of absolute clarity, that true safety wasn't the absence of danger. It was the presence of someone who would stand with you in the heart of the storm. Her choice was not a choice at all. It had been made for her the moment he had looked at her in that rainy alley, not as a prize to be reclaimed, but as a life to be saved. Slowly, deliberately, she walked past the desk, past the offer of a new life. She walked until she was standing in front of him again. She reached up, her hand cool against his cheek, and saw the flicker of hope ignite in the depths of his stormy grey eyes. "I have been running my entire life," she said, her voice clear and steady, "from my family's expectations, from Walter, from myself." She gave him a small, tremulous smile. "I'm done running. My world is wherever you are, Artie. I'm staying." The war with Walter Sterling did not end with a bang, but with a quiet, calculated dismantling. Artie, with Evelyn now a steadfast presence at his side, fought not with the reckless fury of a cornered animal, but with the cold, strategic precision of a grand master. He no longer saw Evelyn as a weakness to be hidden, but as the very reason for his fight, the source of her clarity he had never known. He used his vast network not just to defend, but to attack, unearthing Sterling's dirty secrets, the exploited workers, the bribed politicians, the carefully concealed financial crimes. Armed with leverage, Artie arranged a meeting, not in a back alley, but in the sterile environment of a lawyer's office. There were no threats of violence, only the calm, unassailable presentation of facts. Walter Sterling, faced with the choice between public ruin and private retreat, chose the latter. He disappeared from their lives, a ghost vanquished not by bullets, but by the slow, inevitable pressure of truth. 6 months later, the city was settling into the crisp embrace of early winter. The chaos of the roaring 20s raged on, a frantic dance of progress and prohibition. But in the world Arthur and Evelyn had built, a quiet harmony reigned. The penthouse was no longer a fortress, but a home filled not with silence, but with the sound of laughter, the soft notes of the piano, and the low murmur of conversation that stretched late into the night. Tonight, they were not in their castle in the sky. They were in a place that was purely Artie's, a place he had now made theirs. It was a speakeasy jazz club tucked away in a basement on Rush Street named The Sanctuary. It was his newest venture, a place where the music was authentic, the whiskey was smooth, and the atmosphere was one of intimate escape. The lights were low, casting a warm amber glow over the small round tables. A haze of cigarette smoke hung in the air, catching the light and swirling like captured spirits. On a small raised stage, a quintet was playing a slow, soulful rendition of Stardust, the saxophone weaving a melody that was pure liquid melancholy. Artie stood by the bar, watching the room. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo, but he looked more at ease here, among the artists, the rebels, and the quiet drinkers, than he ever had in a boardroom. His gaze, however, was not on the patrons or the musicians. It was fixed on the woman who was moving through the tables towards him. Evelyn was a vision, in a gown of deep sapphire velvet that shimmered as she walked. Her hair, now a chic, chin-length bob, framed a face that was no longer haunted by fear, but illuminated by a quiet, confident joy. She greeted a musician with a familiar smile, shared a quiet word with the bartender, then came to a stop beside Artie, her hand finding the small of his back. She belonged here. She was no longer a guest in his world. She was its queen. "Everything all right?" she asked, her voice a low murmur against the music. He turned to her, a slow smile spreading across his face. A genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his stern features. "Perfect," he said, and he meant it. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "Dance with me." He led her to the small, crowded dance floor. He was not a natural dancer. His movements were too deliberate, too controlled, but he held her with a reverent tenderness that needed no fancy footwork. She rested her head against his chest, her ear over his heart, and they swayed gently to the mournful, beautiful music. They were no longer a gangster and a runaway. Those labels had been shed like old skins. They were simply a man and a woman who had found each other in the dark. He, the man who had built a fortress to keep the world out, had found the one person he wanted to let in. She, the woman who had been running her whole life, had finally found the place she wanted to stop. The world outside was still dangerous. The shadows still held threats. But here, in his arms, surrounded by the smoky, soulful melody, Evelyn felt an absolute sense of peace. She had learned that a cage was not defined by its walls, but by the absence of choice. Artie had given her a choice, and she had chosen this life, this man, this dangerous and beautiful love. The saxophone hit its final, lingering note, a sound that hung in the air like a held breath. The dancers around them stilled, but Artie and Evelyn remained in their embrace. He looked down at her, his stormy grey eyes soft in the dim light. He had once looked at the stars through his telescope, searching for order in the vast, cold emptiness of the cosmos. Now, he found all the light and all the meaning he needed right here, in her summer sky blue eyes. "I love you, Evelyn," he whispered. The words no longer a confession torn from him in a moment of crisis, but a simple, profound statement of fact, as essential and natural as breathing. "And I love you, Artie," she replied, her voice full of a certainty that warmed him to his soul. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of whiskey and smoke and forever. It was a promise made without words, a quiet sonata played only for them. In the heart of the roaring city, amidst the chaos and the jazz, the gangster and the runaway had finally found their sanctuary. True safety is not the absence of danger, but the presence of a love brave enough to face the storm with you. Freedom is not found in running away, but in the courage to choose where you belong. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more romances.